I had walked the river road for 3 hours before I let myself admit that I was hungry. It was not the hunger that surprised me. I had done this before, pulled the old brown cloak from the chest at the back of my wardrobe, told Rennick, my captain, that I would return by nightfall, and slipped through the servants' gate into the world that my kingdom actually was, rather than the one my court described to me. 7 years on the throne of Valdenmere. 7 years of being told by advisors, ambassadors, and well-meaning uncles that the people prospered, the markets thrived, the wolf packs were content. I preferred to see for myself. What surprised me was how good it smelled. Ashford's Crossing was the largest market town in Valdenmere's heartland, set at the place where the Eld River bent south and 3 old trading roads met in a cobbled square. I had ridden through it a dozen times in procession, with outriders ahead and the royal standard snapping in the wind, and the people had lined the road and bowed, and I had seen nothing. Rooftops, the tops of bent heads. Today I walked in from the eastern road on foot, hood up, boots dusty, and Ashford's Crossing opened itself to me for the first time. The noise of it, the color, the smell of fresh bread that hit me at the edge of the square like a warm hand pressed flat against my chest. My wolf, the great dark creature that lived behind my ribs, that had been restless and silent by turns for 7 years, that had refused every woman my counsel brought to the throne room with a patience I had long since stopped trying to explain, lifted its head. I told it to be still. I was hungry, that was all. The bread stalls ran along the south side of the square, under a long wooden awning that kept the morning drizzle off the goods and the sellers both. I counted 6 of them as I walked the row slowly, the way a man with little coin must walk when he is deciding where his single midday meal will come from. I was not performing poverty. I had left the court with enough silver to buy a meal and a mug of something warm, and no more, because a man who arrives at a market stall with a lord's purse is not walking among his people. He is performing generosity, and I had no use for that. I wanted to see what Ashford's Crossing was, not what it became when it knew it was being watched. At the 5th stall, the smell grew so strong that I stopped walking. The stall was small. A worn plank counter set on 2 sawhorses, a basket of round loaves behind it, a clay pot of something savory sending up a thread of steam, and a woman behind the counter who was serving 2 farmers at once, tearing bread for one and ladling broth for the other, and talking to both of them at the same time, with the easy fluency of someone who had done exactly this for so many years that her hands had learned to work without her attention. She had flour on her left cheek. She had not noticed. The farmers had not told her. I noticed because I was standing 3 steps away doing nothing, which is a thing a man at a bread stall is only permitted to do for a short time before it becomes strange. She looked up. Her eyes were brown, clear, quick, the eyes of a person who measures things without making a performance of the measuring. They went to my face, then to my hands, a habit, I realized. She was looking to see if I was holding coin already or still working myself up to the decision. "You've been standing there a moment," she said, not unkindly. "That usually means either the smell has confused you or you're trying to decide if you can afford it." "The smell," I said, "mostly." She looked at my cloak, at my boots, at the absence of a horse behind me and the absence of a companion beside me, and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a man who is tired and has been walking a long time. "Sit down," she said. There was a low stool at the end of the counter, the kind kept for customers who needed a moment off their feet. I had not been told to sit down by anyone in 7 years. I sat. She did not ask me what I wanted. She tore a piece from a round loaf, the good, dense kind, still warm, and set it on the counter in front of me, and then she ladled a small bowl of the broth from the clay pot and set that beside it, and she went back to her other customers without looking at me again. I stared at the bread and the broth for a moment. Then I ate. My wolf went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the food. Her name was Senna. I learned it not by asking, but because the farmers called it, "Senna, have you got any of the seed loaves left?" And Senna, my wife says to tell you the rosemary ones kept 3 days, and she answered both questions with the same unhurried attention she gave everything, not turning from one conversation before she had finished the last word of the previous one. She was precise that way. Careful. It was not the carefulness of anxiety. It was the carefulness of someone who had learned that a word half spoken or a bowl half filled was a small insult to the person in front of you. I had been on a throne for 7 years. I knew the difference between someone who was careful because they were afraid and someone who was careful because they thought it mattered to be. Senna thought it mattered. The farmers moved on. The square filled and thinned and filled again with the midday rush of the market, and I sat on the low stool and ate the bread and the broth slowly, partly because I was genuinely hungry and partly because I was not ready to stand up and leave yet, which was strange. I did not usually have trouble leaving places. When the bowl was empty, she came back along the counter. "Better," she said. "Much," I said. "What do I owe you?" She named a price that was, if anything, slightly less than I would have expected for the quality of what I had been given. I reached into the cloak for my coin, and she watched without the hungry attention that sometimes appears in a seller's eyes when a customer reaches for payment, not performing indifference either, simply not particularly interested in the coin itself, as if the transaction were the least interesting part of the exchange. I gave her the coin. She pocketed it without counting it. "You walked the Eastern Road," she said. It was not a question. "From Marrow's Gate," I said, which was true. I had left the horses at Marrow's Gate. "Long way. Is there anything else you need before you go on?" My wolf stirred again, not hunger this time. Something older, something I had no clean word for, a recognition that lived below language, in the place where the animal part of me made its decisions without consulting the king. "Another bowl," I said, "if you have it." She looked at me for a moment, the quick, measuring look again, and something in it shifted slightly, from assessment to something closer to amusement. "I have it," she said, and went to ladle it. I stayed for 3 hours. This was not, I want to be clear, a thing I had planned. I had planned to walk the square, take the measure of the market, speak to a handful of traders and craftspeople to get a sense of how the season was running, and be back at Marrow's Gate before the light turned. Instead, I sat on a low stool at Senna's bread stall and ate 2 bowls of broth and 3 pieces of bread and talked. Or rather, she talked when she had a moment and I listened, and occasionally I said something, and she answered it without once making me feel that my question had been foolish or my answer inadequate. This is rarer than it should be. In 7 years of sitting on a throne and being spoken to, I had grown accustomed to people managing what they said to me, softening, shaping, watching my face for signs of displeasure before they finished a sentence. Senna did not do this. She said what she thought at the speed she thought it, and if a customer interrupted her, she stopped mid-sentence and helped the customer, and came back to the sentence afterward at exactly the word where she had left off, as if she kept a running record and it would have been wrong to lose the thread. She told me that the seed loaves had not been selling as well this year, because 3 other bakers had started making them and hers were better, but people went to whoever was cheapest. She told me that the river had run very high in the spring, and the lower market had flooded twice, and 2 stall holders she knew had lost most of their stock and not recovered. She told me that her father's hands had been giving him trouble since the cold, and he could not manage the early morning kneading any more, so she had been rising at the 3rd hour to do it herself before he woke so that he would not feel it as a failing. She said that last part without complaint or drama, as if it were simply a thing that was true and she was describing it accurately. My wolf was very still. Not the stillness of quiet, the stillness of absolute attention. Your father runs the stall, I asked. We run it together. He built it 30 years ago. She glanced to the left, where an older man was resting on a bench against the wall of the adjacent building, a blanket across his knees, watching the square with the peaceful attention of someone who has watched the same square for 30 years and still finds it worth watching. He had the broad hands and the slightly floury forearms of a baker, and a face that had spent so many mornings beside an oven that the warmth had settled permanently into it. When he felt my glance, he looked up and nodded at me with the mild friendliness of a man who had no idea who I was and no particular interest in finding out, and went back to watching the square. He looks well, I said, which was inadequate, and I knew it. He's happy, Senna said. That's the thing that matters. She wiped down the counter with a cloth and looked at me with the measuring look again, but this time what was behind it was not assessment, something more open, as if she had decided, somewhere in the last 3 hours, that I was worth the honesty. You don't seem like a man who is passing through, she said. You seem like a man who is looking for something. I was quiet for a moment. I suppose I am, I said. Did you find it? My wolf moved, not a stir this time, not a flicker, but a long, slow turn, the way a creature turns when it has found what it has been tracking, and there is no longer any need to hurry. I think so, I said. She studied me for a moment, head tilted very slightly. Then she went to serve a woman who had appeared at the other end of the counter, and I sat on the stool and looked at my hands, and tried to remember the last time I had said something true to a stranger without knowing that I was going to. I could not. The afternoon was drawing toward the hour when the market begins to thin, the sellers starting to cover their goods, the buyers starting to think of the road home, when she came back to my end of the counter for what I knew would be the last time before I had to leave. I had been turning over a thought for the better part of an hour. It was not a complicated thought. It was, in fact, a very simple thought, but simple thoughts can carry enough weight to make a man go quiet. The thought was this: she had not known who I was, and she had fed me anyway. Not for favor, not for recognition, not with the slight extra attention that people give when they think the man on the other side of the counter might be worth something to them later. She had looked at my face and my hands and my boots, and the fact that I was alone and tired, and she had torn bread and ladled broth and told me to sit down. And then for 3 hours she had spoken to me as if I were simply a man, which I was, underneath everything else, but which I had not been permitted to be for a very long time. My counsel brought women to the throne room who had been told what I liked. My court arranged conversations in which the woman across from me said the things most likely to appeal to the Alpha King of Valdenmere, laughed at the right moments, tilted their heads the right way. Every meeting felt like a performance I had wandered into, and my wolf, who could not be fooled and did not care about performances, refused every one of them with a silence so absolute that I had, in my darker hours, begun to wonder if it was asking me for something I did not have. Senna had not performed anything. I pulled the empty bowl toward me, and held it in both hands and stood up from the stool. She had her back half turned, setting the remaining loaves in order on the basket behind her. "Are you heading out before the road gets dark?" she said, without turning. "In a moment," I said. I leaned across the counter to return the bowl. It happened between one heartbeat and the next. There was no sound. No light, no fire, no drama, or rather, there was all of those things, but they happened inside me, not visible to anyone else, not yet. It was warmth, first, a warmth that started at my left wrist and spread up through the bones of my arm and into my chest and did not stop there. And then the mark. I looked down at my wrist. The mate mark of the Alpha line of Valdenmere, a mark that I had been told would appear when I found my fated mate. A mark that my father had worn and his father before him, and that I had carried the absence of for 7 years like an empty sleeve, bloomed across the inside of my left wrist in a line of gold so bright it was visible through the cuff of the old brown cloak. And Senna had gone very still. She was still facing the basket, but her right arm had dropped to her side, and she was looking at her own wrist with the expression of someone who is very carefully deciding what to believe about what they are seeing. I said nothing. I waited. She turned around. She looked at my wrist, then at her own. Then at my face, not the quick measuring look this time, but something slower and more serious, the look of a person who is checking their own understanding against the evidence, and finding that the evidence is not cooperating with what they expected. "That is," she began and stopped. "Yes," I said. "That is a mate mark." "Yes." She looked at me again. The stool I had been sitting on for 3 hours, the threadbare brown cloak, the absence of everything that would have told her before this moment who I was. "Who," she said carefully, "are you?" I reached up and pushed the hood of the cloak back from my face, properly back, all the way, for the first time since I had entered the market square. I straightened to my full height, which in the confines of the stall awning was not inconsiderable. Across the counter, Senna looked up at me, and whatever she saw shifted something in her expression, not fear, not calculation, something closer to a woman reassessing a great deal of information very quickly, and arriving at a conclusion she had not anticipated. "Aldrich," I said, "of Valdenmere." Behind her, her father had risen slowly from his bench. Around us, the market had gone quiet. Markets do not go quiet easily. They are living things, full of their own noise and motion, and they resist silence the way water resists a hand pressed into it. But the mate mark of the Alpha King of Valdenmere was visible from 3 stalls away, gold and undeniable, blazing at my wrist and at hers simultaneously. And the market of Ashford's Crossing, which had stood at the heart of this kingdom for 100 years and knew its own history, recognized what it was looking at. The first beau was a man at the spice stall across the square, then the woman beside him, then the farmers who had bought bread from Senna an hour before and not thought to look twice at the man sitting on the low stool. Senna was not looking at any of them. She was looking at me. "You sat on my stool," she said, "for 3 hours." "Yes." "And ate 2 bowls of broth. 3 pieces of bread as well." She looked at her wrist again, at mine. The marks were identical, the interlocking linework of the Alpha bond, gold fading slowly to the deep bronze it would carry for the rest of our lives. "You were testing something," she said. It was not an accusation. She was working something out. "I was looking for something," I said. "I had been looking for a long time." "And you found it," she said slowly, "because I gave you bread." "You gave me bread," I said, "before you knew I was worth giving it to, before you knew I was anything at all." I held her gaze across the counter and said the thing that had been sitting in my chest for 3 hours, gathering the weight of a truth that had been true long before I could say it. "That is exactly why." She was quiet for a long moment. The market was quiet around us. Her father, 3 paces away, was watching her face with the careful attention of a man who is waiting to see what his daughter decides, not trying to decide for her. "I would have given it to you anyway," she said at last, with a faint note of defiance, as if she wanted the record to be clear on that point. "If you had been a nobody, I would have given it to you anyway." "I know," I said, "I know that now." She looked at me for another long moment. And then, because she was who she was, and because some things about a person do not change regardless of what they discover, she reached across and straightened the empty bowl on the counter between us with one flour-dusted hand, a small practical gesture, the gesture of a woman tidying up before she steps away from her work. "My father's hands have been bad since the cold," she said. "I'll need to make arrangements." "His bread stall," I said, "will have a place in the courtyard of Valdenmere's great hall, by royal decree if he'll accept it." She looked at her father. He raised both eyebrows and shrugged, the shrug of a man who has been watching the market for 30 years and has decided to take the extraordinary in stride. "He'll accept it," she said. I came around the end of the counter. The people of Ashford's Crossing were all standing now, and all of them were facing us. The king in the threadbare cloak and the bread seller's daughter with flour on her cheek. And the mate mark blazed at both our wrists, and not one person in the square could look away from it or pretend they had not seen. I took her hand, not the ceremonial hold of a king, her hand in mine, her flour-dusted fingers against my palm, the way you hold something you have been careful with since before you understood its value. "I am going to need to borrow that stool again," I said, "for the ride back to Marrow's Gate. It is a longer walk than I planned for." Something shifted in her face. Not the smile exactly, the decision behind the smile. The moment a careful person decides to trust something they have measured very thoroughly from every angle. "I have a cart," she said. "My father can drive." The court of Valdenmere had opinions about the bread seller's daughter. My counsel had opinions. My chamberlain had opinions expressed through the careful arrangement of his face into an expression of professional neutrality that I had learned, over 7 years, to read as deep misgiving. Lady Orving, who had been positioning her own daughter toward the throne for the better part of 3 seasons, had opinions that she expressed through the strategic placement of herself in every corridor I walked through for the first week, so that I would be reminded at regular intervals that there were other options. None of them had an argument that worked against the mate mark. It is one of the useful things about a fated bond. It does not require consensus. It does not submit itself to committee. The mark on my wrist was the same mark my grandfather had worn, and his mother before him, and it was as legible to every wolf in Valdenmere as written text, more legible, because it could not be revised or reinterpreted, only read. The Alpha King's fated mate had been found. Whatever arguments existed about her origins, her rank, or the appropriate social distance between a throne and a bread stall dissolved, one by one, against the fact of the bond, the way arguments against weather dissolve against the weather itself. Senna did not help matters by being impressed. She was not, in fact, particularly impressed by the Great Hall, which was the largest stone building in Valdenmere, and had been described to me by every dignitary who had ever visited it as a structure of imposing grandeur. She walked through it on the first morning and looked at the vaulted ceiling and the carved columns and the long banquet table and said, "The acoustics are very good. Does anyone sing here?" When told that a great hall was not typically a venue for singing, she nodded as if this confirmed something she had suspected, and went to look at the kitchens, where she was immediately in a detailed conversation with the head cook about the water temperature for bread dough before I caught up with her. She was not performing anything. She was simply herself, the same person she had been at the stall, in the court's great hall as in the market square, with her flour-dusted attention and her quick hands and her habit of finishing one thing before she started the next. The court, which had spent 3 seasons adjusting its behavior for a series of noble candidates, did not quite know what to do with a woman who did not notice that it was performing. She noticed, she simply did not find it interesting enough to mirror. By the second week, 2 of my council members had stopped by the kitchens on the grounds of various administrative preoccupations, and had, separately, ended up in conversations about bread. By the 3rd week, Senna's father, who had brought the cart and the bread stall apparatus with an equanimity that I had begun to recognize as the particular equanimity of a man who had raised Senna, and was therefore not easily surprised by developments, had set up his stall in the courtyard as promised, and every morning the smell of good bread moved through the lower hall and up the stairs and into the corridors. And the guards at the eastern door had started timing their patrol rotations around the hour when the first loaves came out. My wolf was the most contented it had been in 7 years. Not because things were easy. A bread seller's daughter stepping into the Luna's role in a Wolf Kingdom's court was not a frictionless process, and I will not pretend it was. There were meetings I had to attend that she did not. There were customs and protocols and the long institutional memory of Valdenmir's court that had to be navigated with patience, and Senna navigated them with the same deliberate care she gave everything, not performing poise, but actually acquiring it, piece by piece, with the focused attention of a person who has decided something is worth learning. She asked questions that were precise enough to embarrass people who had been doing their jobs for 20 years into realizing they had not thought about why. She remembered what everyone told her and used it correctly the next time, which is a thing that sounds simple but is not. The mate mark never faded. It settled into the deep bronze it was always going to become, and it was visible at both our wrists when she stood beside me at the great window that overlooked the courtyard in the evenings, and the court could not look at it without understanding, whatever else they thought, that this had not been a king's whim. A king's whim does not carry the bloodline's mark. Lady Orvin stopped placing herself in corridors in the 4th week. I noticed her one morning, standing at the edge of the courtyard watching Senna's father arrange the morning loaves, and then accepting a small piece of bread when he offered it with the mild generosity he brought to everything, and eating it with the careful expression of someone discovering that something they had decided was beneath them is actually rather good. I did not say anything about this to Senna, but she saw it too. I know because when we were walking back from the window that evening she said, without any particular emphasis, "The rosemary ones." I told him to make more of the rosemary ones, and the small smile at the corner of her mouth told me she had been watching the same courtyard from the same window. The ceremony was in the Great Hall, 3 months after the afternoon in Ashford's Crossing. I will not describe it at length, because the part of it that mattered most is the part that happened after, but I will say this. When Senna walked into the Great Hall and the assembled court and pack representatives of Valdenmere saw the mate mark blazing at her wrist, the same mark that blazed at mine, the sound that moved through the room was not the polite acknowledgement of a political arrangement. It was something older than politeness. The wolf people of Valdenmere recognized a fated bond. They had been raised on the stories of what it meant for the Alpha line, the bond that could not be faked or forced, that had been dormant in me for 7 years, that had found its answer not in a throne room negotiation, but in a market square over a bowl of broth. They recognized it, and the recognition moved through them like a current, and the hall went entirely still. Senna stood in it without looking away from me. She had flour on her cuff. She had not noticed. I had not told her because some things are too precisely themselves to correct. I said what I had to say. She said what she had to say. The pack elder who conducted the ceremony had the particular expression of a very old wolf who has seen a great many things and is pleased, in the most private part of himself, to see this one. And then it was done. The thing I return to, when I sit in the evenings at the long table of the great hall and watch the candlelight settle into the stone and listen to the sound of a kingdom at rest. The thing I return to is not the ceremony, and not the court's final acceptance, and not the morning when my chamberlain arrived at my study to report, with the neutral face that I now read as quiet satisfaction. That the Luna of Valdenmere had spent an hour in the lower hall, listening to the grievances of 3 families from the river district, whose compensation claims had been lost in the administrative chaos after the spring flood, and had resolved all 3 before the midday bell. What I return to is the low stool at the end of the counter, the worn plank and the 2 sawhorses and the clay pot of broth and the woman who looked at my boots and my tired face and said, without consulting my rank or my worth or my coin, "Sit down." 7 years I had looked, and what I found was not in a throne room or a great ceremony or a formal presentation of candidates. It was in the fact that she did not wait to be given a reason. She saw a man who was tired and hungry and she fed him, and the reason was the hunger itself, and the man himself, and nothing else. My wolf understood that before I did. Every morning now, the bread comes up from the courtyard, her father's stall, which has been there long enough that the guards have stopped remarking on it and started planning their days around it. And the smell of it moves through the lower hall and up the stairs and into the corridor outside my study, and I stop whatever I am doing and I go downstairs. And every morning Senna is there before me, quick-handed and precise, tearing bread and ladling the morning broth into the bowl she keeps for me on the left side of the counter, the same left side she kept it on in Ashford's Crossing, because she is careful that way, and because some arrangements, once made correctly, do not need to be changed. She gives me the bowl without asking if I want it. She already knows. And I sit on the stool, a better stool now, the old one having been retired to the corner of the courtyard where it serves, as far as I can tell, mainly as a roost for one of the kitchen cats, and I eat the bread and the broth, and the mark at my wrist is the bronze of a thing that has been true for a long time, and the kingdom around us is going about its mourning, and Senna is talking to the first customer of the day with the same unhurried attention she gives everything. She does not know that I watch her. Or rather, she knows, and she does not make anything of it, which is a thing I have come to understand is one of the forms her love takes. She gives it without announcement. She simply does the thing and trusts that the doing is enough, and it is. It always has been. A king can search 7 years for the thing that makes him feel like a man, and find it on a low stool at the edge of a market counter, in a bowl of good broth given without condition. I do not think I will ever stop being grateful that I was hungry that morning. And I do not think she will ever stop feeding me, whether I am a king or a nobody, because that is not a thing that depends on what I am. It depends on who she is. And who she is, flower-dusted, quick-handed, precise, unhurried, giving before she is asked and asking for nothing in return, is the only Luna that Valdemir or I will ever need.